Human rights violations are happening right now in the United States, and the victims are children. The treatment of children in the criminal justice system is one of the largest government-sanctioned human rights abuses in the world today. Nearly 700,000 children were arrested in 2019 alone. 90% were interrogated without legal counsel. Because most states don't have a minimum age for prosecution, children as young as 5 and 6 years old have been arrested in the United States. Every year, 76,000 children are prosecuted as adults. 83% of these children are racial minorities. On any given night in America, 4,500 children are housed in adult jails and prisons, where they are at an increased risk for physical and sexual violence. For their protection, many are placed in solitary confinement. More than 10,000 children have been sentenced to life imprisonment, some with and some without the possibility of parole. Sentencing children like adults is a violation of international human rights law. Yet, in Texas, Louisiana, North Carolina, and South Carolina alone, there are nearly 10,000 people in prison for crimes they committed as children. Throughout it all, the majority of our country has looked the other way.
This is a human rights issue, and frankly, it is a stain on our country.
The future of our children and our nation's standing as a beacon for human rights depends on us, and Human Rights for Kids is leading the charge. Human Rights for Kids is a bipartisan, nonprofit organization working to promote and advance human rights protections for children in the United States. From public education to grassroots organizing, policy advocacy, and more, Human Rights for Kids is on the front lines fighting to transform child justice reform.
We're all united in the belief that we need to do better by our children, that the reason why our children end up in the justice system is because of the trauma that they've experienced, that we need to address that trauma, and that we need to have this basic infrastructure in place to make sure that these broader human rights violations aren't taking place against our kids.
But the work is far from done. We're focused on developing trauma-informed and age-appropriate measures for children in the justice system, ensuring that every child has an equal chance in the race of life. But we need your help. Every action is critical. Every person can make a difference. Every child deserves hope. Together, we can advance human rights for kids. How will you help?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Human Rights for Kids 5th year celebration anniversary. My name is Michael Mendoza, and I'm the Director of Advocacy for the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, but I'm also a member of the advisory board for HRFK. And I'm really excited to be here to celebrate their 5th year anniversary. But before I get started, I am going to ask our amazing guest speakers and panelists to join me on camera at this moment while we continue in this moment in time, really to take a time to celebrate such an amazing 5th year anniversary for an amazing organization, the Human Rights for Kids. And so I just want to welcome us all to give a round of applause. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So we're going to hear from all these amazing panelists shortly after I bore you all with a little bit of my own comments about how amazing the Human Rights for Kids Watch is. And so with that, HRFK, one of our dear partners, somebody that I love to work with, James Dold and the Human Rights for Kids, has successfully advocated on many pieces of legislation across the entire country. We're really talking about the introduction of 55 bills, state and federal. We're talking about the passage of 9 new laws that ensure children have access to legal resources, that have access to assistance, not only at the time of arrest, but we're talking about ending mandatory minimums and life without parole sentences for youth. We're talking about ending lifetime parole supervision for children and establishing a minimum age for children in juvenile court. These are laws that have been enacted by an amazing organization to protect not only our children, but our future generations. And when we talk about an organization that is a staunch advocate for children, this is just part of the proof that HRFK, the Human Rights for Kids, has been doing an amazing job in the last 5 years. The Human Rights for Kids has also authored and filed 3 amicus briefs. These are briefs in the US Supreme Court, one of which was even cited by the court, affirming really important Supreme Court rulings like Miller versus Montgomery as law of the land, as well as 3 briefs in state Supreme Courts, one of which helped retroactively ban the use of mandatory minimum sentences on youth. HRFK's legal work has also brought into focus the impact of the appellate court's decisions on youth who are tried as adults, including, for instance, the impact of non-unanimous jury convictions on children in Louisiana and Oregon, as well as harsh mandatory minimums under 3 strikes laws. As a result, the Human Rights for Kids work in legislatures and courts across the country. Literally, thousands of children have been impacted by these laws. Children who, when they experience human rights abuses in the legal system, have been impacted by the work of Human Rights for Kids. Human Rights for Kids also has a groundbreaking 2020 National State Ratings Report. It's one of my favorite state ratings report that has come out in quite some time. It came out in 2020 and really provides a picture of what our country continues to need to do, how states can continue to align with the priorities that HRFK has set forward to protect all children in this country. This state ratings report has shined a critical light on the human rights abuses happening right now in the US against system-involved youth. This report has been cited in numerous op-eds as well. The media is looking at it as a source that experts should look at and that states and policymakers should pay attention to because we are in desperate need to continue to protect our children all across the country. And so for members of Congress and state legislators who are using HRFK's report as a really important watershed moment in their push for transformational change, and we're seeing that this year and across the country in all different states because of the work that HRFK has been able to do. In addition to serving on the Human Rights for Kids Advisory Board, I also work closely with HRFK as a member of a national coalition that Human Rights for Kids helped to launch and bring together, bring together many different organizations and directly impacted communities around the set of shared principles that focus on protecting the human rights of children in the criminal justice system. And I'll just say that it has been an honor for me to be a part of this coalition that Human Rights for Kids has brought together in their expertise, in their leadership, to really allow us a space to bring our resources together, to strategize together, and how we should coalesce and protect children across the country who engage with the criminal justice system. And so since the coalition launched in January of 2021, what we really have been excited about is that we have successfully advocated for the introduction of several human rights bills in Congress that are currently even moving forward to this day, all because of the leadership of James Dole and the Human Rights for Kids. And we are talking about legislation that protects not only kids at the point of arrest, such as Congressmember Tony Cardenas and Senator Cory Booker's bill to protect Miranda rights for youth by ensuring that they are provided access to legal counsel, just to even understand what the Miranda rights are prior to even waiving them. But also in working with Congressmember Bass to introduce one of the largest criminal bipartisan support legislation ever introduced in Congress. We're talking about a bill that protects kids by establishing minimum juvenile and adult court ages, by looking how kids are protected and stayed away from adult facilities and jails, and other important provisions in the Karen Bass bill. But we haven't just had the privilege of working with Karen Bass, Congresswoman Tony Cardenas, and Senator Cory Booker. But one of the amazing things about the Human Rights for Kids is that it is a bipartisan organization that prioritizes working across the aisle with all elected officials. And so we're also very excited that within our work together in this broad coalition of organizations to protect children's rights, that we've also been able to work with Congressmember Bruce Westerman, Congressmember Bruce Westerman, Senators John Cornyn, and also Senator Amy Klobuchar on some really important legislation around sentencing reform and second chances. We're talking about legislation that would end juvenile life without parole federally by allowing a judge to give discretion after someone has served 20 years of incarceration when they were under the age of 18 when they committed their crime. We're talking about second chances for children. And we're talking about staunch legislative support from some of our highest top-ranking officials in Congress. And so when we talk about the work of the Human Rights for Kids, we're not just talking about them individually as an organization, but as a leader in this space that brings many organizations together, elected officials together, both Republicans and Democrats, to protect our children. And so not only is a ban on JLWOP that we are working towards right now currently in Congress, included in these provisions in Congress, but these are also provisions that were included in the First Step Act implementation by Senators Durbin and Grassley, which passed the Senate Judiciary Committee last spring. So it's momentum that HRFK has continued to advocate for through their expertise and leadership. But the provisions in these bills that were identified by HRFK in their National State Ratings Report is now essentially model law that we should continue to look towards in protecting the human rights of children. With the leadership of HRFK and with these principles and blueprints that we now have nationally, this bipartisan coalition and the backing of many legislators across the country, including the support of the National District Attorneys Association. For the first time ever, we have law enforcement support, understanding the important data that we have through the State Ratings Report, and also because of the stories of impacted individuals that HRFK prioritizes to put at the center and at the forefront of their advocacy efforts. Because one thing that the Human Rights for Kids prioritizes and is very central to our coalition is ensuring that the leadership of directly impacted communities is at the center of this very important work to protect children through changing of the hearts and minds of our policymakers and those who can have room in their hearts to understand that children do deserve second chances. And I should know because I also am one of those individuals that is formerly incarcerated. James Dole has allowed me to comfortably share even my own story in this work, where unfortunately I was one of those 15-year-old kids who made the worst decision of my life by deciding to get into a car with 3 other kids and unfortunately committed a gang-related murder and took the life of another young man. We were all held accountable as we should have been. I was tried as an adult. I was sentenced to life in adult prisons and grew up in adult prisons. And so what I like to say, by the grace of God, policy saved my life and allowed me to prove that I was no longer that 15-year-old kid anymore. These are the same type of policies that the Human Rights for Kids, James Dole, and all of the amazing supporters and board members are strongly supportive. Policies that will provide more kids the same kind of hope and opportunity that this country needs to ensure that future generations come home and are restored with their families, to ensure that we have public safety and a future generation that is healthy and whole. What our work together as organizations and in a coalition has meant so much, not just to kids and adults who were formerly kids sentenced extremely in criminal justice, but to families, but to communities, and even to survivors of violent crime. And being able to see the coalitions and groups come together to advocate for smart policies that really protect our children. And so what I want to just continue to say as we get ready to introduce some amazing guests and speakers who can also attest to the amazing work that HRFK does, I just want to make sure that today we are not here just to celebrate an organization, but we're here to celebrate a human rights movement that HRFK has helped to build, a movement that centers those of us who have experienced human rights abuses as children. Because now it actually does feel like our voices can be heard, that we are a part of the solution, and that we're not just here to tell our stories and to inflict pain and trauma or any of those things, but to come together for the purpose of wanting our communities to be safe as well. And so I want to thank James Dole and Human Rights Kids from the bottom of my heart. And now also with my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce some of our next guests and speakers. And so next, I do want to have the great pleasure to introduce from the great state of Arkansas, Human Rights for Kids Child Rights Committee members, Laura Berry, and Human Rights for Kids board member, Senator Greg Leding, to talk more about the Human Rights for Kids work.
Thank you, Michael. Laura, I would defer to you if you want to go first.
You can go first.
As Michael said, I'm Greg Leding, state senator from Fayetteville, Arkansas. Just delighted to be here this morning as someone who fully supports Human Rights for Kids mission, as a founding member of the board, and as someone who has had the great fortune not only to watch its founder, James Dole, in action for more than a decade now, but who has had the great fortune to work alongside him and be a part of his work, because it has truly been the most rewarding of all the things that I've done during my time in office. And it has also led me to meet Laura Berry, who we'll hear from here in just a few minutes. Her advocacy and her commitment to these causes, I have no doubt will result in the passage of more legislation. We've already seen her help make progress in some of these issues. Just real quick, in the last legislative session in 2021, she came to me, she said, we've been able to do away with juvenile life without parole, but we want to raise the age from 18 to 21. Said, I'm willing to do whatever, but we have to be very realistic about our odds in this particular Judiciary Committee. I wasn't sure we'd even get a motion, but because of her testimony and the testimony of the incredible people that Sheila arranged to speak that day, we nearly got that bill out of committee. We changed some hearts in that room, and it was through her heartfelt words, her story, and again, all the people that she brought together to speak on behalf of that bill. So just so delighted with what we've been able to see from this organization over the last 5 years, the people it has introduced me to, and the rewarding work that it has allowed me to be a part of.
Thank you, Greg. So first I want to say thanks to James and Greg. We not only was I given a second chance after 32 and a half years, but working with James and Greg, we were able to, in 2019, pass in the state of Arkansas to end a lifetime of parole for juvenile lifers who were granted a second chance under Act 539, but also to open education for any juvenile that enters the Department of Corrections, no matter what their sentence, when before you had to be within a certain amount of time to get that opportunity. The act we passed in 2019 also, it eliminates parole, lifetime of parole after 5 years. So at the end of this year, I will not only come off parole, but I'll be eligible to vote for the first time in my life. And like Greg said, we're also working to end juvenile under 21 instead of under 18, because the brain does not fully develop till the age of 24 to 26. All of that is in huge part to the work that James does through Human Rights for Kids. And so with that, I'll go back to you, Greg.
Well, and I just want to stress that that bill, Act 821 of 2019, that helped, among other things, restore voting rights to Arkansans who were incarcerated as juveniles, was again an example of just the power of bipartisanship. I am a member of a very small minority in our legislature. And in 2019 was my first term in the Senate. I had served 8 years in the House. So I'd built up quite a few relationships over there, had relationships in the Senate, but was still kind of feeling my way around. But again, because of the incredible advocacy of so many people and just having James there alongside me, we were able to get that bill out of the Senate unanimously, which again, as a member of the minority in a chamber dominated by the other party, that meant a lot. But it really speaks to, I think, the fact that this is an issue that isn't partisan, should not be partisan, because we are talking about children. And, as long as you show a commitment to working across the aisle and being willing to share credit, there should be no reason that we can't find allies of just all across the political spectrum. Because, I did have the pleasure of serving in the majority for one of my 6 terms, but have been in the minority since my 2nd term. And so, making sure that I have support across the aisle is essential to getting anything passed, but it is something that I do truly believe in and work to make a part of every piece of legislation that I work on, but particularly in this sphere, because again, this is one where it might at times have its partisan edges, but I believe those can all be sanded away and that we can find a way to work together. And again, that bill that helped restore voting rights is one of prouder accomplishments during my time in office. And again, just getting to work alongside Laura on so many of these other issues, it means so much and really makes what can be a very challenging and frustrating job rewarding and worthwhile.
Thank you, Greg. I just want to say Human Rights for Kids has changed so many lives and gave so many people a second chance, and is continuing to work to do just that. And currently I'm working with James, and we'll be reaching out to Greg because we have several people coming up that's going to test that law in just a few months. So I'm looking forward to that. So Human Rights for Kids is definitely an organization that has accomplished a lot in a small amount of time. So I can't wait to see what's next.
Yeah, I would echo that. The accomplishments of the organization, in what was essentially its infancy, just these first few years in a state like Arkansas, just really, again, speaks to the power of the issues, the willingness of people to come together to address these issues, and just, again, the incredible work of James and everyone at the organization.
Absolutely.
Laura, Senator Leding, thank you both so much for all of the work you do, not only in support of the Human Rights for Kids, but in your own home state, Senator. What you have done has been a very amazing spark to our work to this day that has just created this momentum for children that is very much needed. And Laura, congratulations to you. I'm thankful so much for your success. You're a continued testament as to why we need to continue to provide second chances to children. So thank you both so much for your work. And also, yes, Senator, thank you so much. And as we just continue to celebrate HRFK's 5th year celebration, perhaps nothing exemplifies HRFK's effectiveness more than how they have reframed the national conversation around how and why children end up in the legal system to begin with. This work really began with survivor leader and acclaimed author, Sarah Cruzan, who began working with HRFK back in 2018 around the groundbreaking policy known as Sarah's Law. Unfortunately, Sarah will not be able to join us here today. But what I will say is Sarah, as a dear friend and advocate, is an amazing leader in this space who just exemplifies why children deserve second chances, but is also not only an amazing groundbreaking author, but a dear friend in this movement and a leader in this space. But here is a video that we really want to show you briefly.
a very important conversation with the TAM fam today, a necessary one, if I can say that, about the crisis of human trafficking around this country. And we've been talking with Sarah Cruzan. She's the author of the new memoir, I Cry to Dream Again, which details her painful experience of being sex trafficked as a teenager and her battle for freedom after she was in prison for killing her abuser. We're joined also by James Dole, a human rights attorney and trafficking survivor who is fighting alongside Sarah to make sure what happened to her does not happen to other people. James, thank you so much for joining us as well.
Pleasure to be here, Tamara.
Sarah, as we said before the break, you were in prison for over 19 years. In 2013, you were finally set free after Arnold Schwarzenegger, the governor of California at the time, commuted your sentence. You walked into prison a 16-year-old girl and walked out a 35-year-old woman. How do you process the moment? You're walking out, but you said, why did I ever have to even be here?
It was an array of emotions, you know. It's hard to encapsulate the feeling other than that hope and faith and perseverance and the beauty of being able to come together and what that looks like and how you can change really hard situations.
I was so struck by the fact that you say that everyone you met in prison, like you, experienced some level of abuse and victimization prior to entering the system. You were there for years. One of the stories that I covered in Illinois that still haunts me to this day, I went to a women's prison, federal prison, and almost every woman there was the victim of abuse and victimization, yet they were behind bars.
Yes.
What do you want people to know about those women and whose stories aren't on the national news?
That it's time that we go in and we talk to individuals and find out what led up to their particular trauma and not highlight the violence. It's like something happened to cause the reaction. And
James, I know that you studied Sarah's case. You got in touch with her when she was still behind bars, and you told her you wanted to help her impact change. And you've been working on the law, Sarah's law, to prevent any other children from suffering the way Sarah did. What was it about? The obvious details would attract anyone to want to help her. But beyond wanting to, you dove in to help her.
That's right, Tamara. And I think for me, early on, when I learned of Sarah's case, it really struck a personal chord because I had been a victim of child sexual abuse and child labor trafficking. I met my abuser when I was 13 years old. So when I was reading through Sarah's case file about her experience of grooming and how her abuser really preyed on her vulnerabilities and then used the most precious thing that we are given as human beings, love, against her, it really reminded me of what I had experienced for over 2.5 years of my life as a teenager. And I just felt compelled that what had happened to her wasn't right, that we really needed a stronger legal response in place. And the sad reality is, to Sarah's point, the overwhelming majority of children who are in the criminal legal system are victims of child sex abuse, physical violence, neglect, some sort of trauma that they've experienced that have led them to that place in their life. And that's why we as a society really need to wrap our arms around them, protect them, love them, and have a system response in place that isn't just punitive in nature.
Wow.
And so there you have it, everyone. Sarah Cruzan, survivor leader, acclaimed author, and the most courageous person that I know, who can share her story and talk about why we need to protect children, especially young women and girls. This is what the Human Rights for Kids does. They allow people to share our stories in a very intimate and important way that can affect change. And so I am very grateful to Sarah Cruzan and all the work she does. A central part of HRFK's work is also advocating for vulnerable children in the criminal legal system. They have launched an innovative campaign focused on the submission of amicus briefs in every appellate case that potentially impacts children who are tried as adults. One of those cases involved non-unanimous jury convictions and their incredible work with Jerome Morgan, who was wrongly convicted by a non-unanimous jury in Louisiana. I want to welcome Jerome. Jerome, if you can turn on your camera. And Jerome, I just want to ask if you can please share with us about your work with HRFK over the past few years and what their work has meant to you and others impacted by this unconstitutional practice. Thank you, James.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Jerome Morgan, and the work with Human Rights for Kids has been one of my most important work that I've ever done. Of course, I was affected as a child by human rights issues. I was wrongfully convicted at the age of 17. And also, you know, my then girlfriend was 3 months pregnant with my first child. And so I hadn't met my own child the whole 20 years that it took me to prove my innocence. And not only that, you know, I was raised in foster care due to my own parents being incarcerated. So, you know, these issues that we are trying to resolve around the world, and especially here in the United States, and particularly in Louisiana, has affected my life from generation to generation to generation. It's 3 generations that has been affected by mass incarceration. And you know, the main issue that we see, you know, child neglect and abandonment. And you know, broken homes, and you know, children that are taken advantage of. So, you know, yes, this has been by far my most important work, and you know, it's just been my privilege and honor to be able to work along with James and the rest of the people with this organization.
Jerome, thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate not only your work alongside Human Rights for Kids, but your success and everything you do out here to continue to advocate for others in the same situation that you were in. And so thank you so much, Jerome, for being here and celebrating with us on this 5th year anniversary for HRFK.
I appreciate you. Thank you so much.
One of the things that makes HRFK unique is that it never stops innovating or advocating on behalf of vulnerable children. Over the last several years, HRFK has worked closely in coalition with defense attorneys and advocates across the country. Here to share about what this work has looked like during the global pandemic, please join me in welcoming McCall Gross of the Maryland Office of Public Defender and Valerie Slater, CEO and founder of Rise for Youth. Welcome.
Thank you, Michael. I guess I will get started and then pass it over to Valerie. My name is Michal Gross. I'm a public defender in Maryland where I represent youth. I first got involved with Human Rights for Kids in the early days of COVID about 2 years ago, when I was fighting for the human rights of my clients who are incarcerated, and especially for the youth who are incarcerated in adult jails. Human Rights for Kids offered support and advocacy, and more importantly, they helped amplify the voices of the people directly impacted by the system. At a time when every single motion that I filed, every single call for help was ignored, Human Rights for Kids, and specifically James Dold, helped prepare my client's mother before she spoke to congressional leadership about the impact of COVID for youth who are involved in the system. In addition, Human Rights for Kids has a history with the Maryland Office of the Public Defender. In the past year, Maryland has passed landmark legislation which overhauls our youth justice system. Human Rights for Kids was part of the coalition that made that happen. And specifically the advocates in Maryland and Maryland Office of the Public Defender was able to use Human Rights for Kids state ratings to show that Maryland was one of the worst human rights offenders, along with Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Wyoming. We use this data to encourage lawmakers to focus on how we treat children in the justice system and to help them realize that Maryland was not as progressive as they thought. In the next 5 years, I will continue to raise these issues in court, and I will continue to work with Human Rights for Kids on legislative reforms to ensure the rights of youth in the justice system, and I look forward to seeing what comes next.
First of all, I want to say congratulations, Human Rights for Kids. It is an absolute honor to be here celebrating you and celebrating the great work that you have done over these 5 years. And it's as I am listening to everything that you have been a part of, as in awe of you as I have been, I am in greater awe now. And I'm so grateful that Rise for Youth is a proud supporter and a collaborative partner in the work. Our collaborative work thus far over this short period of time has already begun to yield so many impactful results, and they continue to reverberate across the Commonwealth. Some of the work that we've been able to accomplish together during the 2020 legislative session was the passage of House Bill 35, which allows for the possibility for parole for incarcerated individuals who were sentenced as youth and who have already served 20 years of their sentence. So getting rid of the juvenile life without parole. And then similarly, House Bill 744, which gives judges the ability to depart from that mandatory minimum sentence guideline for youth convicted as adults. And so that's, of course, getting rid of that de facto juvenile life without parole. Also, during the 2020 session, House Bill 746 increases due process protections for children in Virginia by requiring the notification of parents before a child is interrogated. And we're working even harder now to expand House Bill 746 to include the representation that children must receive representation during any questioning. So even at that first conversation with police, ensuring that there is legal representation there. And even taking it a step further, we advocated for this past session for the elimination of the use of deceptive tactics in interrogation. It didn't pass, but we will come back because we know that children are much more susceptible to just wanting to please someone who's talking to them. And then when we take the authority figure of a police officer and wanting to either just go home or get out of the situation, children will speak up and not in their own best interests. And so we'll continue to push for that. And, you know, also during the 2020, after 2020 session, we worked together. Human Rights for Kids created a Know Your Rights flyer for children and parents around House Bill 746 and educating communities about this new law. And we were able to work together because Rise for Youth, we have regular coalition meetings, and Human Rights for Kids were able to get that information out to a large segment of community. And it continues to reverberate the impact of letting folks know that you have rights. Those rights are expanded. And when those rights are violated, that there are consequences. And so there are thousands of children who are subject to arrest every single year in Virginia, and our work together on that one issue, it has already positively impacted the lives of tens of thousands of children here in Virginia who have come into contact with the legal system. We're carrying on our work together with the support of the Weisberg Foundation, and we are actively working to make Virginia the first jurisdiction in the country to enact we are looking to establish a minimum age for juvenile court jurisdiction. We are working to increase the age of JDR court jurisdiction up to age 20. I heard someone else mention that. We're trying really hard to establish that here in Virginia. We also want to end direct file, end felony murder as a charge for youth. We want to ban solitary confinement, remove all youth from the adult jails and prisons here in Virginia. And we also want to transfer our Department of Juvenile Justice from the Public Safety and Homeland Security Secretary to the Health and Human Resources Secretary. We've got a lot of work on our plate, and we're so excited to have Human Rights for Kids right beside us every step of the way. I want to just also quickly add, Human Rights for Kids, they are a national treasure. Is it all right to say that? They are indeed a national treasure. The work that they have been able to do and continue to do, it is amazing. They're a champion, they're a leader, and so very importantly on the state level, Human Rights for Kids is a partner. They're a partner that's willing to bring their full weight of advocacy, expertise, and influence to bear on the issues of advocacy that are happening on the ground at the state level. Rise for Youth, we are a statewide organization, and the work that we are doing, it is bringing impact. But when you bring in the national leaders, when you bring in those national leaders who are having such a significant impact across the nation, folks stop and listen. They listen a little more intently. And we are so proud of the work that Human Rights for Kids has already accomplished and the work that they are continuing to do with us here in Virginia. We celebrate you. We're excited to be your partner, and we are excited to cheer you on as you continue your great work across the United States.
Valerie, Mikal, thank you both so much for your work, for your partnership, for your support. Valerie, I think you should continue in moving forward as the MC. That was amazing. Yes, definitely a national treasure is HRFK. And so is all of your work, and we truly appreciate your work and being here on this 5th year anniversary celebration for HRFK. And what I'll continue to say, just as a reminder for everyone in the audience as well, you're hearing from so many amazing people about the important work of HRFK. But the work needs to be funded. And so I do want to remember and remind everybody as we continue along in the celebration to think about how you can support HRFK. Donations, grants, even by going onto their website and sharing the work yourself as well with so many people that you know. But as we move forward, I also want to say that behind every great organization is great leadership. And no one exemplifies that leadership more than HRFK's board president and vice president, who have shepherded the direction of the organization since the beginning. If it were not for their leadership, there would be no Human Rights for Kids. Please join me in welcoming Suzanne LaPierre and John Ellum. Hi, Suzanne. Hi, John. Thank you both so much for being here. Thank you both so much for your leadership. We'd love to hear from you about HRFK.
If it's okay with you, John, I'll start up. Michael, first of all, thank you so much for the kind introductions and for emceeing this event. You're doing a fabulous job. I'd also like to start and just extend my heartfelt thanks to all of our presenters and everyone who's been directly involved in our work on behalf of HRFK, particularly those who have suffered such profound injustices under our existing system. Thank you not only for your courage in sharing your stories with us, but then despite all of that, coming back and advocating actively on behalf of others so that we can make changes in the system so no other child suffers the unconscionable treatment that you've suffered. So thank you. You are our inspiration and you are our heroes. So jumping back, it is hard to believe it's been 5 years that HRFK has been around. I was privileged to be asked by James in the beginning to help spearhead the organization. It was a profound honor when he asked me to do that. I'd known him from anti-trafficking work, which he'd been involved in it quite some time at Polaris project. And I, at the time, was in Alaska, just beginning to do a little anti-human trafficking work. I was immediately struck by James's, not only his expertise, his intellect, his determination and drive, but his compassion and his just true commitment to this cause. In terms of HRFK, I was just thrilled with James's vision, and from two perspectives. One, a very personal one, which is prior to my being a lawyer, my undergraduate work involved neurophysiology and behavior. I've always been fascinated by cognitive development, particularly that in the children. When I went to law school, one of my mentors was a juvenile justice scholar. But I did go to work immediately in juvenile justice issues. I worked in the environmental law field and then on self-determination issues for peoples. So when James presented the idea of HRFK, I was thrilled. I was like, wow, I'm actually going to get to combine my legal expertise with my undergraduate work and interest in neurophysiology and behavior. On a professional level, what really struck me about James's vision was two things. One, that it's a unique organization, that it focuses on the full panoply of human rights for children. There are other organizations which touch on juvenile issues or have it as a project within a larger program, but ours is the only organization that looks at all human rights for kids within that lens. And we do look to international documents such as Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And very sadly, the US does not fare well when we stack up against other countries and in terms of implementing those guarantees. So that was the first aspect of James's idea that intrigued me. And the second one, which has been mentioned earlier, is the bipartisan nature of the organization. We have a substantive focus, and it is on human rights for kids, and particularly at this juncture, on their rights in the criminal justice system. We have a board right now which has, I believe, 6 current or former Republican state legislators and 5 Democratic ones. We have been able to come together and work on the substantive issue without any partisanship. It shows that if you can focus on the substance and have a diversity of opinion, which I think is incredibly important. If you want to come up with solutions to problems, you don't want everybody touting the same line and saying, oh, this is how to do it. You need this incredible diversity that you get when you respectfully consider other people's, all different people's opinion. And I just have to compliment our board because that's what you do, what you have done, and I know what you will continue to do in the future. It's what makes, one of the things that makes HRFK absolutely unique, and I believe should be a model for organizations, groups, governmental, non-governmental, when you're addressing substantive issues. I think, at this point, I've spoken enough. I do, in addition to thanking our board in general, I want to highlight John Ellum, who's been our fabulous vice president, and who I am really hoping is going to assume the presidency at our next board meeting, pending our board approval. I know everybody will be enthusiastic in welcoming him to assume that position. I would like to turn matters over to him now to talk a little bit about why he got involved in HRFK and to give just a brief summary of some of the substantive matters we've worked on both in the state and the federal legislative area, as well as our advocacy in court. We've accomplished an amazing amount in 5 years. I am thrilled to see what it is we're going to be able to do in the next 5 years, but we do need the support, as Michael mentioned earlier, of all of you who have supported us in the past, those of you who are online today. We need this. James has, I mean, as amazing as he is, he's one person. We need some help. So thank you for your past support and thank you for your current support. James, John?
Thank you, Susan. Those certainly would be big shoes for me to fill. Welcome everyone to our 5-year party and thank you for attending. I'm John Ellum and I'm an attorney in West Virginia and a former state delegate. So sometime back in 2012, 2013, I was done early for the day at the Capitol, having some meetings canceled. And I almost came real close to going back to my down in Charleston, but decided to go to the office and return some phone calls. No sooner did I sit down when our legislative assistant came back and said, there's a Mr. James Dold here to see you about human trafficking. I thought, well, that's interesting. A new one sort of for me, somebody not wanting to talk about potholes or taxes being too high. So that was my first meeting with James. And one thing you can say about James, when you talk with James and get to know him and work with him, I mean, you learn something. And I had at that point no idea just how important a role that local state policy played in human trafficking. We worked together 2 years later, my last year in the legislature, 2014, when in West Virginia, we eliminated juvenile life without parole and gave the option for parole after 15 years, which much to my pleasure and thanks to James' efforts and others, ended up being model legislation. So I ended my service and of course had a law practice to go back to, but kind of wondered, well, how am I going to be able to still be active in public policy and things of that nature? I did testify at a couple of state legislatures in favor of eliminating juvenile life without parole, working again with James, really enjoyed that. So when he came to me with the opportunity to start this new organization and be a board member, I jumped at the chance to work with him and have never looked back and certainly have never regretted it and enjoyed every day of it. It was a good fit for me, much like what Susan said. I had a reputation as a legislator of being nonpartisan. Sometimes that got me a lot of goodwill. Sometimes that made some people angry, but I love it that our board is comprised the way that it is comprised. I also really enjoy our approach, multi-pronged approach to advocacy. So as Susan and others have indicated, we advocate in court. We advocate in state legislatures and Congress, and we advocate, in public policy advocacy. We started right off. We got right into it. We entered into the Malvo case, if you'll recall, the DC shooter, where we filed an amicus brief with the United States Supreme Court. I think that was one of our very first efforts. So, what a thing to take on, but we wanted to ensure and protect this decision in Miller that banned juvenile life without parole. Our brief was cited. The case was never decided. It turns out that Virginia, while the case was pending, changed their law to allow at least the option or ability to try for parole. So we never got a ruling, but we made it into the legal books, so to speak. The case, though, that really impacted me probably the most, that was talked about earlier, was our work in the Edwards case, which came off of the Ramos decision, which involved 2 states, Oregon and Louisiana, that provided for non-unanimous juries. I was shocked, having practiced criminal law for quite a few years at one time in West Virginia. I took having a non-unanimous, a unanimous jury, I took it for granted. And then I guess you don't know what you don't know. When I learned that 2 states were still doing this, and if you read Justice Gorsuch's decision, which goes into the Jim Crow history and policy behind non-unanimous juries, it was shocking that such a thing could exist in this day and age to me. And on the heels of that Ramos decision, we filed an amicus brief in Edwards unfortunately, we weren't able to, but we wanted to, it was a tall order. We wanted to make that decision retroactive, but we did file an amicus brief in that case. I mentioned Maryland, I mentioned Virginia earlier, and some people have also mentioned many successes in Maryland. So now we have recently started some individual case litigation work. Maryland recently passed the Juvenile Restoration Act to give juvenile life without parolers an ability to have another court hearing and petition for release. So we have a client in Maryland, James and I, who has been incarcerated, I think 37, 38 years, and will be filing his petition very soon. And we're very excited about that. Also excited about, my bailiwick, working with state legislatures and working with Congress. We've done so much. I could speak until our 10-year anniversary occurred on what we've done at the state level. I know in West Virginia, I'm trying to get past custodial interrogation bill to require legal counsel to be present before juveniles are subject to custodial interrogation. So hopefully that'll be another win for West Virginia. We do editorials. I've done several editorials, and James, Susan, and others have done editorials. And again, not afraid to go in and wade into some tough waters. We recently did an editorial for Kyle Rittenhouse. You may recall the shooter up in Wisconsin. Although he got a lot of publicity, both supporting what he did and not supporting what he did, there was nothing really to address the human rights aspect and the fact that he was still a child. And we wanted to remind everyone of that and how the UN Convention on the Human Rights of Children would prevent such a prosecution for this young man. So, I'm really proud of these positions we've taken. I've thoroughly enjoyed the work. We're growing. We certainly need everyone's support to help us continue to grow. But our outreach has been great. We have a state rankings report that ranks all 50 states in terms of how well they provide protection for the rights of children, and hope to expand on that in the future. As you can imagine, that's quite a large undertaking. So again, thank you for your support of this great organization, and certainly look for some big things to come from us. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you so much, John and Suzanne, for your leadership and your continued support for HRFK and all the great work that you are doing. And finally, before I introduce the person of the hour, I just want to remind everybody to please donate to HRFK's 5-year anniversary fundraiser. There's a link on this chat, and we'll share out later on in the day. But just so everybody knows that this month, all donations will be tripled by a generous donor this month. So let's get some donations in this month. But now it is my pleasure to introduce our last speaker and my dear friend and mentor, none other than HRFK's CEO, James Dole.
Thank you so much, Michael. And you've done an incredible job, my goodness. I was getting teary listening to you and many of the other speakers just on the incredible work that we've been able to do together. And I hope that that is the major takeaway that folks have walking away from today's celebration. Human Rights for Kids, from our inception, we always really looked at ourselves as more of a field catalyst, where our obligation and our work was to center around uniting the broader field and bringing groups from across the political spectrum together around a common cause, and putting in place a blueprint, a model for where we as a broader movement wanted to go. And no one organization does this alone. And we are proud to have partners from the Office of Public Defender in Maryland, to Valerie's group, Rise for Youth, to our friends in the Maryland Youth Justice Coalition in the state of Maryland, to the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, Michael's organization, to our friends and colleagues at the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth, Rights for Girls. I could go on and on about all of the incredible organizations that we work with: R Street, Human Rights Watch, Campaign Zero, World Without Exploitation, ECPAT USA. There's so many, National Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Coalition. And I don't want to leave folks out, but there's just so many incredible organizations that have really made all of this work possible. And so our work is really a credit to you all, and your willingness to work alongside us in birthing really this human rights movement for children. I know that we're bumping up against the hour here. But I wanted to share with folks, a couple of really exciting things that we have on the horizon at Human Rights for Kids. And what better way to kick that off than to introduce for a few remarks herself, our newest member of our staff, the current Democratic Minority Leader of the great state of Oklahoma, and soon to be former representative, Emily Virgin. Emily, I want to invite you to come on screen just to say a few remarks about your time on the board, and just to introduce yourself to folks as our newest member of our staff, as our incoming policy counsel. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you, James. And I apologize for any background noise. As many of you who work with legislatures know, the ends of May or approaching sine die can get a little bit crazy. But I can't tell you all how honored and humbled I am to be joining the staff and get to work with James on a daily basis. Listening to John Elam about his first interaction with James reminded me of when I first started working with James. I introduced legislation in Oklahoma to ban juvenile life without parole. And this guy named James Dole just would not leave me alone. And I thought, man, this is a guy who is tenacious, who is driven, and who really cares. Above all, who really, really cares and is passionate about what he's doing. He was with a different organization then, but his passion and his drive have remained the same. What has really drawn me to Human Rights for Kids is a few things: the bipartisan nature and the focus of remaining bipartisan, because that's truly the only way that we get things done in state legislatures. We've seen it time and time again, that you have to have a broad bipartisan coalition. And James is incredible at making that happen. And then, it's so important that HRFK centers those who have been affected by the human rights abuses that we see in our criminal legal system all too often. So we center those stories, but we also combine them with the data. So we're reaching folks who learn and process in all different ways. Our state ratings report and model legislation and the data that we provide, they provide not just a vivid picture of the problem, but also the solutions and the steps that we can take to solve the problem. So I, again, am just so honored and humbled to begin working with Human Rights for Kids. I can't think of a better way to wrap up my 12 years in the legislature than taking this step on just something that I am incredibly passionate about and excited about. So thank you all, and happy 5-year anniversary to HRFK.
Thank you, Emily. And we're just so honored that you're going to be working with us in this new capacity. So thank you. Thank you. I also want to take a moment to thank both John and Suzanne. This work, I can't tell you how many volunteer hours those two have put in. And, I was remarking to Suzanne that there is no doubt in my mind that she is the mother of Human Rights for Kids, for all that she has done for the organization, for how she has stewarded us through our beginning transition, and the incredible work that John has done in helping to also mentor me along in providing guidance as we've taken on more and more cases and have gotten more involved in litigation work over the years. So often, young men, well, I'm not so young anymore, but younger lawyers don't have strong mentorship, and John has been there every step of the way, as well as Suzanne, who's a human rights lawyer in her own right, to really provide that guidance and mentorship. So I just really can't thank them enough for their incredible leadership, and I'm excited to continue to work with them. And I know we're over time here, so I'm not going to spend too much time on my remarks, but I would be remiss if I did not take a moment and ask everyone actually to join me in taking a moment of silence for the young children and the victims down in Texas who were brutally murdered just a couple of days ago. Please join me in a quick moment of silence for those individuals. as I was thinking about what I might say in addressing you all today, on the one hand, I was sort of torn because this was meant to be, a celebration of what we've accomplished. But this week's events are also a stark reminder of how far we still have to go in protecting the human rights of every child in this country. And there's nothing more fundamental from a human rights standpoint than the right of children to have their lives and to be safe and secure in their person. And so what happened to the young children in Texas was the gravest of human rights violations. And as we continue on our work going forward, whether it's in the criminal justice reform or whether it's working to protect children from violence and harm, or working to advance educational equality and equity for children, and whatever we are doing at Human Rights for Kids, we will constantly have the memory of those angels who were taken from us, as well as the children who've been killed by too much random and senseless violence in this country for far too long. We really have to continue to work as a nation from a bipartisan standpoint to prevent tragedies like this from happening, and to make sure that we envelope our children with love and care and compassion, because they are our future and they represent our hope and really what is the best of us as a society. And so on that somber note, thank you all so much for all of your work. Thank you to all of our presenters and speakers, to Michael for emceeing today's event, for Suzanne and John, for Nicole and Valerie, for John and Laura. You all are our inspiration. We are going to continue to advocate to end human rights abuses against children in the United States. And also thank you to all of our supporters, our allies, as well as our funders, folks like the Coalition for Public Safety and Arnold Ventures and Danny Casey Foundation and the Weisberg Foundation, the Abell Foundation, Just Beginnings Collaborative. There are so many incredible, the Dan Paul Foundation. There are so many incredible supporters that we have that have really made our work possible. The Grant Makers for Girls of Color, Neo Philanthropy. There are so many great partners. Thank you all so much. Everything that you've heard today about the work that we've accomplished these past 5 years is a credit not to one organization or one individual, but to every single person who's come together as a community to create this human rights movement for our children. And that's what we're going to continue to do over the next 5 years. Thank you so much for joining our celebration. Have a great rest of your day, and we look forward to being in touch. Take care.